The 90s buried a bunch of absolute masterpieces beneath mountains of VHS tape and forgotten streaming rights. Fantasy cinema had just exploded with technological possibility, practical effects reaching absurd heights, and filmmakers swinging for the fences with stories nobody thought could be filmed. Yet somehow, genuinely spectacular films got demolished by critics, tanked at the box office, or simply vanished from our collective memory. These aren't the Lord of the Rings films everyone worships or Jurassic Park that defined an entire decade. These are the films that got left behind, sleeping in bargain bins at video stores, waiting for audiences brave enough to discover them. Today we'll resurrect 15 forgotten fantasy films from the 1990s that absolutely deserve your attention and a second shot at cinema history. Dragonheart, 1996. Rob Cohen made a medieval fantasy where Dennis Quaid's ridiculously mulleted knight befriends the last dragon voiced by Sean Connery, and somehow this became one of the most criminally underrated fantasy films ever made. The setup sounds completely ridiculous, but the execution transforms it into something genuinely heartfelt and adventurous. Draco wasn't just a talking dragon dumped into a live-action film. He was a fully realized character, personality, gravitas, humor, and an actual emotional arc. Sean Connery's voice work brought sophistication to a creature that could have been gimmicky, giving Draco nobility without making him feel out of place. The visual effects were genuinely groundbreaking for 1996, with ILM developing specialized software just to lip-sync Draco's mouth to Connery's recorded lines. The film made $115 million worldwide, proving audiences wanted this story, but critics demolished it for having a confusing script. Roger Ebert loved it despite its flaws, recognizing something pure about its commitment to being fun. The heart themes, the betrayal narrative, the ultimate sacrifice, these resonated with audiences who rented this obsessively. Yet Dragonheart faded from discussion, overshadowed by darker fantasy works, and eventually surpassed by CGI that looked more realistic but felt less emotionally present. The practical creature work, the Eastern-influenced sword choreography, Dennis Quaid's earnest performance. This film deserves recognition as a genuinely sophisticated family fantasy adventure that respected its audience while delivering pure spectacle. The 13th Warrior, 1999. John McTiernan directed what became the biggest box office bomb of 1999, losing over $100 million, yet it's emerged as possibly the most underrated action fantasy film of the entire decade. Antonio Banderas plays Ahmed Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat exiled to the frozen north, where he encounters Vikings preparing to battle a legendary evil. The premise feels insane on paper, but the execution transforms it into something genuinely visceral and atmospheric. The film lost control during production when Michael Crichton took over directing after test screenings bombed, resulting in reshoots that inflated the budget past $150 million. Yet, despite this chaos, what emerged feels cohesive. Brutal, muddy, foggy Viking warfare, juxtaposed with impossible monsters and genuine camaraderie between warriors from completely different cultures. Jerry Goldsmith's score is monumentally powerful, conveying epic scope without bombast. The action sequences remain some of the finest practical work of the 90s, with McTiernan using weather, darkness, and smoke to create disorienting, terrifying combat. Audiences who first experienced it claimed McTiernan had influenced Game of Thrones and modern fantasy aesthetics. Critics destroyed it initially, but passionate advocates have since recognized it as proof that studios could make ambitious fantasy films about cultural exchange without sacrificing action credibility. The film's visual language, the practical creature design, Antonio Banderas's fish-out-of-water charm, these elements create something genuinely special that deserves recognition beyond its commercial failure. The Rocketeer, 1991. Joe Johnston made a period action fantasy set in the 1930s about a stunt pilot who discovers a jetpack and becomes an unexpected hero fighting Nazis and crooks. The film sits in that weird zone between superhero origin story and pulp adventure serial, but it works spectacularly through sheer commitment to its tone. Jennifer Connelly plays a heroine who transcends damsel territory by actually affecting plot outcomes. Danny De Niro delivers one of his most entertaining comedic performances as a flamboyant air pirate with genuine menace beneath the humor. The practical flying sequences hold up remarkably, combining practical stunt work with early CGI compositing that feels surprisingly seamless. The costume design is impeccable. The retro aesthetic never feels like parody, instead creating a genuine world where jetpacks exist within reasonable 1930s adventure logic. The production design, the miniatures, the practical effects work. Everything feels handcrafted with care. The film received respectful reviews, but never became a cultural phenomenon the way Indiana Jones films did, instead occupying this strange, forgotten space in adventure cinema. Modern audiences discovering it tend to be surprised at its quality, its humor that doesn't rely on irony, its genuine heart about believing you can become a hero. The film proved Johnston understood how to film practical action with style and purpose, yet somehow, Rocketeer vanished from conversations despite being one of the most complete adventure films ever made. Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me, 1992. David Lynch made what audiences initially hated, a film that dragged Twin Peaks away from coffee shop wholesomeness into the genuine horror and darkness of Laura Palmer's final days. Critics and fans equally rejected this, but Lynch was following his artistic vision into territories television couldn't explore. The film looks increasingly like Lynch's purest creative work, abandoned compromises with TV network demands, and allowed him to make something that genuinely disturbed viewers. Cheryl Lee brings such vulnerability to Laura that her tragedy becomes unbearable. The film descends into supernatural nightmare territory that feels absolutely earned, because we understand Laura's desperation and her helplessness. The supernatural elements aren't just scares. They represent the predatory forces destroying a young woman who has no escape. Lynch's direction becomes increasingly expressionistic. Cinematography warps reality. Dream logic replaces narrative logic. Critics complained about this at release, wanting more traditional mystery elements, but time has validated Lynch's approach as sincere reflection on trauma and victimization. The practical effects work is genuinely unsettling, not pretty or exciting, just wrong in ways that disturb you. The soundtrack creates dread through abstraction rather than traditional scoring. This film shows fantasy and horror merging into something that transcends genre categorization. Modern audiences discovering it often apologize for the initial critical rejection, recognizing it as one of Lynch's bravest films and one of the 90s most genuinely artistic works. The film deserves recognition as a masterpiece of horror fantasy that refused to compromise its vision for audience comfort. Highlander III, The Final Dimension, 1994. After the absolute catastrophe that was Highlander II, director Russell Mulcahy reclaimed the franchise and essentially erased its predecessor from canon by making this film an alternate sequel that just pretended Highlander II never happened. Christopher Lambert returns as Connor MacLeod, and the film basically resets the mythology back to something resembling the original while exploring new dimensions of the immortal concept. The plot involves ancient sorcery, a new threat sealed away for centuries, and the reintroduction of magic as a legitimate element of the Highlander world. The action sequences return to practical sword fighting, rather than the sci-fi nonsense that plagued Highlander II. Mario Van Peebles brings genuine menace as the primary antagonist. The film respects the mythology while acknowledging fans' hatred of the previous installment. Production occurred in Canada and Asia, providing gorgeous locations that ground the fantasy elements in physical reality. The practical stunt work is genuinely impressive, with sword choreography that makes combat feel dangerous rather than choreographed. Highlander III remains criminally forgotten, even by franchise fans who default to discussing only the first film and the television series. The film actually contains better pacing than the original in many ways, allowing character moments to breathe while maintaining action momentum. Critics dismissed it upon release as a mediocre sequel, but time has revealed it as a sophisticated attempt to rehabilitate a franchise that had been completely derailed. Modern audiences discovering it often express surprise at its quality, its commitment to practical effects, and its willingness to expand the mythology intelligently. Labyrinth, 1986, rediscovered in 90s. Jim Henson crafted a fantasy maze filled with practical puppetry that somehow got overshadowed upon release, but exploded in popularity throughout the 1990s as audiences discovered it on home video. David Bowie's presence transcends actual acting into pure charisma. The leather pants, the hair, the sexuality radiating from every frame Bowie made Jareth the Goblin King impossibly cool. Jennifer Connelly navigates this world of practical creatures with genuine performance, never winking at the audience about how weird everything is. The puppetry work is genuinely grotesque and unsettling. These creatures don't exist to be cute. They exist to create an uncomfortable, uncanny valley that makes the film feel genuinely otherworldly. The Escher-inspired maze sequences play with perspective in ways that still feel revolutionary, creating vertigo through practical set design rather than special effects tricks. Score by Trevor Jones builds dread and wonder simultaneously. The film initially tanked financially, but found its cult audience during the 90s rental boom, becoming a staple that people watched over and over, discovering new details with each viewing. By the time the 90s ended, Labyrinth had rehabilitated itself into a recognized masterpiece through word of mouth rather than critical consensus. The practical effects age better than CGI because they were designed to feel timeless rather than cutting edge. Modern audiences discovering it tend to be stunned at its sophistication, its willingness to be genuinely unsettling, its commitment to practical world building. The film proves that fantasy can be visually unique and emotionally complex while remaining accessible and engaging. The Secret of NIMH, 1982. Don Bluth refused to Disneyfy this animated fantasy about a field mouse forced to save her family, instead embracing psychological darkness and existential dread that most animated films refuse to touch. The animation style blends watercolor backgrounds with hand-drawn characters in ways that create visual uniqueness impossible to replicate today. The voice cast includes Elizabeth Hartman and John Carradine, bringing genuine dramatic weight to rodent characters. The film's representation of the NIMH experiments deals with themes of scientific exploitation and what happens when nature gets tampered with by humanity. The red-eyed owl sequences are genuinely terrifying, not fun scares, but existential horror that children actually found disturbing. Mrs. Brisby's character arc is pure adventure heroism driven by maternal desperation rather than conventional hero motivation. The film initially bombed but found passionate audiences throughout the 80s, and especially during the 90s when audiences seeking alternatives to Disney animation embraced it enthusiastically. The practical effects work involving animation cells and backgrounds creates depth that digital animation still struggles to achieve. The film's darkness never feels gratuitous. It earns emotional weight by taking the stakes seriously. Modern audiences discovering it express surprise that an animated film could tackle such serious themes without feeling preachy. The film remains a masterpiece of fantasy animation that proves the medium can explore complex emotional and thematic territory. Critics now recognize it as one of the finest animated fantasy films ever made, proving that audiences wanted more sophisticated animated stories. The Last Unicorn, 1982. A completely different kind of animated fantasy where a last unicorn journeys to save her species, accompanied by a butterfly and a bumbling magician, encountering darkness that threatens to erase magic from the world. The animation style is absolutely distinctive. It doesn't look like anything else ever made, blending character animation with environments in ways that create a completely unique aesthetic. The voice cast includes Jeff Bridges, Mia Farrow, and Jeff Bridges, creating emotional performances that ground the philosophical themes. The script explores genuine despair about extinction and loss, the inevitability of change, the sadness of the world losing magic. The king's defeat at the hands of forces beyond conventional violence represents genuine hopelessness, yet the film refuses to succumb to despair. The animation conveys emotional complexity through subtle performance that modern digital animation often lacks. The soundtrack by Jimmy Webb creates genuine wonder and melancholy simultaneously. The film was commercially ignored, but found passionate audiences during the 90s through home video, becoming a cult classic that people obsessed over. The practical animation effects combined with hand-drawn character work create a visual style that remains distinctive decades later. Modern audiences discovering it react to its genuine emotional depth and its refusal to condescend to its audience. The film proves animation can explore philosophical and metaphysical territory while remaining visually engaging. Critics have since recognized The Last Unicorn as a misunderstood masterpiece that refused commercial compromise for artistic integrity. Conan the Barbarian, 1982. John Milius directed a barbarian fantasy that functioned as Shakespearean tragedy about revenge, ultimately proving empty, wrapped in sword-swinging action that never sacrifices character development for spectacle. Arnold Schwarzenegger delivered his finest dramatic performance. The visual progression from man-child to hardened warrior to hollow victor creates genuine emotional arc. James Earl Jones brought gravitas to Thulsa Doom that made the villain feel genuinely threatening rather than cartoonish. The practical action sequences are genuinely brutal and visceral, depicting medieval warfare as messy and unglamorous rather than glorified. The score by Basil Poledouris is orchestral perfection, sweeping themes that create genuine epicness without bombast. The film made respectable money, but critics took years warming to it. Yet by the 90s, audiences increasingly recognized it as a masterpiece of how to adapt pulp fantasy seriously. The practical effects work combined with location cinematography created a world that feels lived in rather than theatrical. The film's influence on modern fantasy is undeniable. Every barbarian warrior fantasy since owes a debt to Conan's template. Schwarzenegger's performance demonstrates how serious acting can ground fantastical material. Modern retrospectives acknowledge Milius created something genuinely timeless about the nature of violence and what warriors actually are beyond romantic mythology. Highlander, 1986, cult classic. Russell Mulcahy made an immortal warrior film that initially flopped but became a cult phenomenon throughout the 80s and 90s, generating sequels, television series, and passionate fan devotion despite critical dismissal. Christopher Lambert plays Connor MacLeod with genuine vulnerability beneath warrior capability. Sean Connery's mentor figure brings Shakespearean weight to exposition. The sword-fighting choreography is genuinely distinctive, creating style that influenced every action film afterward. The Queen's soundtrack is absolutely perfect, the rock songs creating emotional resonance that traditional scoring might not achieve. The film's concept that immortals must eventually duel until only one remains creates genuine stakes for every encounter. The practical effects work combined with location cinematography in Scotland creates atmospheric beauty that drags you into the world. The film tanked initially, but found its audience through home video and television broadcasts, eventually becoming recognized as a masterpiece. The mythology Mulcahy created proved durable enough to support multiple films, television series, and continued fan interest decades later. Audiences discovering it decades later express surprise at how engaging the narrative remains, despite the 80s production values. The film proves that fantasy action films could achieve genuine emotional depth through character development and thematic complexity. Critics eventually acknowledged Highlander as a pioneering work that proved commercial fantasy could achieve artistic legitimacy. Dark City, 1998. Alex Proyas created a noir sci-fi fantasy that got completely overshadowed by The Matrix, but actually predates it and functions as a completely different exploration of reality, manipulation through art direction, and practical effects rather than CGI spectacle. The off-kilter 1950s aesthetic combines with noir sensibilities to create a visually distinctive world that feels genuinely alien despite using Earth architecture. Rufus Sewell is absolutely menacing as the primary antagonist. Kiefer Sutherland brings genuine unease to his portrayal of detective vulnerability. Jennifer Connelly creates emotional grounding in a world designed to be disorienting. The production design is absolutely phenomenal. Every frame contains layers of artistic choice. The cinematography creates genuine dread without jump scares. The practical effects work combined with minimal CGI, creates a visual style that aged better than pure digital work. The film was a box office bomb that seemed destined for obscurity, but passionate advocates have spent decades defending it as proof that visionary filmmaking could transcend commercial failure. The score creates genuine atmosphere without relying on obvious musical cues. The film explores philosophical concepts about identity and reality through visual storytelling rather than exposition. Modern audiences discovering it react to its genuine weirdness and commitment to a unique aesthetic. The film proves that fantasy cinema doesn't require massive budgets or cutting-edge effects if you have genuine artistic vision. Critics have since recognized Dark City as a masterpiece of practical fantasy filmmaking that proved innovation doesn't require CGI. In The Mouth of Madness, 1994, John Carpenter made a meta-horror fantasy about an insurance investigator hunting a missing horror author and discovering a town where the author's narratives literally play out in reality, creating genuine dread through storytelling rather than scares. Sam Neill brings genuine obsession to the central role, descending into madness through practical performance rather than obvious effects. The cinematography creates genuine atmosphere through color and composition. The practical effects work is genuinely unsettling, not jump scare tactics, but existential weirdness that disturbs you. The script explores themes about narrative control and how stories shape reality. The film arrived in an era before meta-horror became mainstream, causing critics to dismiss it as overly clever without substance. Yet, by the 90s end and into the 2000s, audiences increasingly recognized it as proof that Carpenter remained brilliant. The locations create genuine wrongness through ordinary spaces filmed at unusual angles. The score creates dread without obvious horror movie tactics. The film's twist that the investigator is actually inside a story himself creates philosophical implications that haunt you. Modern audiences discovering it recognize Carpenter's commitment to genuine horror rather than spectacle. The film proves that fantasy horror can achieve artistic sophistication through conceptual originality rather than practical effects. Critics have since acknowledged In the Mouth of Madness as Carpenter's most visionary film, and Dreams, 1990. Akira Kurosawa made a collection of 8 separate dream sequences connected by magical presence and Japanese folklore, exploring themes of nature, technology, beauty, and mortality through pure visual storytelling rather than conventional narrative. Each segment is essentially a complete short film with its own visual language and thematic concerns. The cinematography is absolutely gorgeous, each sequence building distinct visual worlds through color and composition. The practical effects work combined with location photography creates dreams that feel emotionally true rather than surreal in artificial ways. Film received moderate attention upon release, but found passionate audiences throughout the 90s who recognized it as a masterpiece. Van Gogh's sequence featuring the filmmaker's transformation into the painter's body creates genuine beauty alongside melancholy. The nature sequences create spiritual resonance through visual storytelling rather than religious preaching. The film proves that narrative doesn't require conventional story structure to create meaningful artistic experiences. The score enhances each segment while maintaining distinctive identity for each dream. Modern audiences discovering Dreams often express that it changed their understanding of what cinema could accomplish. The film's influence on how contemporary filmmakers approach visual storytelling remains significant. Critics have since recognized Dreams as Kurosawa's final masterpiece, and proof that even late-career work by genuine artists could achieve greatness. Highlander Endgame, 2000. Russell Mulcahy returned to direct the 4th installment, which simultaneously concluded the theatrical films while connecting to the television series, bringing together Christopher Lambert's Connor MacLeod and Adrian Paul's Duncan MacLeod for a final confrontation. Bruce Payne brings genuine menace as a villain whose motivations feel personally meaningful rather than generic evil. The action sequences represent some of the best practical sword-fighting choreography of the entire franchise. The emotional stakes between the two immortals create genuine weight to their conflict. The production design creates genuinely beautiful cinematography of locations that feel lived in. The practical effects work combined with location photography creates visual poetry. The film was initially controversial among fans, but has emerged as a worthy conclusion to both the theatrical films and television series. IGN gave it 8 out of 10, praising its commitment to the franchise mythology. The score creates emotional resonance through thematic music that respects the original Highlander's legacy. The film's willingness to end the saga rather than extend it indefinitely demonstrates artistic integrity. Modern audiences discovering it recognize it as a sophisticated action fantasy that earned its emotional climax through character development. The film proves that sequels could achieve genuine artistic merit when filmmakers commit to meaningful storytelling rather than commercial exploitation. 15 forgotten fantasy masterpieces from a decade when filmmakers were willing to take genuine risks with source material and original concepts. These films got buried by box office bombs, critical dismissal, or simply forgotten by audiences distracted by newer releases. Yet each one contains genuine artistry, practical craftsmanship, and commitment to creating worlds that transcend commercial calculation. Now, I need to know which of these films you've actually seen. Drop a comment telling me your favorite forgotten 90s fantasy film, or which one you're adding to your watch list. And here's the controversial bit. Are modern fantasy films actually better than these 90s gems? Or have we traded practical artistry for digital effects that look impressive but feel emotionally hollow? Comment below, and let's start a genuine debate.